I have been on and off with Eric for 7 years. I'm in charge of breaking up, and he's in charge of getting back together. But after I broke up with him for the last time, he didn't try to reconcile. Instead, he got himself a lover who looks very much like me. To pamper her, he took away my resources. He effortlessly gave the leading actress I pursued for 10 years to her. At the awards ceremony, when asked if I regretted the breakup, I just smiled, raised my hand to reveal the engagement ring between my fingers. I'm getting married. As I finished speaking, everyone saw the usually cool and aloof Eric, suddenly red-eyed. At the fashion banquet, I arrived in style, but alone. Curious, a reporter asked, "Helen, is Eric not accompanying you this time?" Just then, there was a commotion in the distance. Looking over, Eric got out of the car and intimately held hands with the woman beside him. Everyone was shocked. This was the first time in 7 years that he had changed his companion. In the past, it was always me by his side. Now it was Mandy, a popular actress known for her innocence. Entertainment reporters had once compared her looks to mine and found some similarities. Eric showing up with her seemed like a story of a substitute defeating the original. Reporters swarmed around. I looked up and met Eric's gaze, his eyes filled with indifference. I politely nodded and then turned around as if nothing had happened, heading towards the inside of the venue. On the way, my agent Mary asked quietly, "No wonder Mandy can steal your fashion resources. Who did you think was standing behind you?" "It's Eric." "Did you two have another fight?" I shook my head. "We didn't fight. We broke up." Mary sighed, not surprised, and advised, "It's only halfway through the year, and you've already broken up 3 times. Every time, Eric swallowed his pride to appease you. You should at least relent a bit, or Mandy might really take him from you." In everyone's eyes, all year round, it was me causing trouble. Eric was always the one making peace. As for Mandy, she was just a pawn Eric used to get back at me. As long as I yielded, Eric would immediately come back to me. But I knew. Eric wasn't playing games, he was making a statement. He was telling me that if I wasn't willing, there were plenty of others who would be. I clenched my fists, and the diamonds on the hem of my dress pricked my skin, causing a slight pain but also making me more clear-headed. We were not getting back together. In a determined tone, I said, "This time, it's truly over between him and me. I have been with Eric for 7 years. We've broken up and reconciled more than 20 times during that period. I initiate the breakups, and he does the reconciling. He's a wealthy young man, surrounded by countless beautiful women, yet he's willing to swallow his pride time and time again to please me and win me back. Whenever I miss him, he would rush to me from miles away and embrace me. Many people advised me not to be so dramatic, not to create scandals by arguing with him. They could see that he was all about me, so why keep breaking up over trivial matters that only hurt our relationship? I understood, but I always found it hard to control my emotions, and more than once, I cried in the middle of the night. He would hold me tight against his chest and use his deep voice to soothe me, saying, "Why call it drama? Clearly, Helen loves me too much, lacks security, and I'm willing to indulge her." I looked up at him, eyes glistening with tears, and asked, "For a lifetime?" "For a lifetime," he answered without hesitation. We were so young then. Love is always fiery and passionate. We always thought that saying for a lifetime would be easy, but it turned out to be just a notion. Thinking back, I felt a slight bitterness in my heart. Mary asked me, "Why did you break up this time?" I paused, blinked slowly, and finally glanced at the 2 people snuggling not far away, speaking softly, "He's getting married and wants me to be his mistress." Mary was stunned. I downed the drink in my glass, hiding my reddened eyes from everyone's view. I told her, "I don't want to." Mary's face turned pale, muttering, "Absurd. How absurd." But Eric didn't see it that way. He spoke of it as if it were the most natural thing. "Helen, I've already made a deal with Amy. We will only be a couple on the surface, and privately she won't interfere with me, and I won't interfere with her. We can still be together." Amy. The heiress of the Smiths Group. Also the bride-to-be selected by Eric's family. Unintentionally, I had learned through Eric's secretary that they might be getting married. Thinking I was going to get a denial from him, I never expected such a bombshell. How ridiculous. My boyfriend of 7 years was getting married. And he wanted me to be his lover. Looking at the man in front of me, my heart paused unexpectedly for a moment before beating rapidly, making my nose tip uncontrollably tingling. I didn't know whether to be angry at his slight or sad about my lost love. But Eric just gazed at me, looking calm and confident. As if he believed I would agree. Because I loved him so much. But all I could ask was, Eric, did you never plan to tell me about your impending marriage? Eric furrowed his eyebrows slightly, a hint of confusion in his eyes. So what if I'm getting married? I love you, Helen. It's common in this circle, you've seen it before. Yes, I had seen it. I had seen it all. In the 7 years we were together, he always took me to all the gatherings, big or small. I witnessed couples looking affectionate in front of the camera, but distant in private. I had also seen marriages of convenience, with each person doing their own thing in private. But I never thought this would be us. We were so deeply in love. I was convinced we would marry, have children, and stay together forever, but I was wrong. Eric never intended to marry me. All this time, it was just me being overly sentimental. I withdrew my hand from Eric's and said each word clearly, but I don't want to be your invisible mistress. Eric frowned, but still patiently explained, Helen, not a lover, you are my wife, my old lady. As for Amy? He couldn't say a word. He couldn't deny Amy's identity, but still didn't understand why I cared so much about her existence. Maybe, we were never on the same page from the beginning. I lowered my eyelids lightly, covering my red eyes, and slowly said, Eric, I don't do mistresses. Helen, don't you want to be with me? We said we'd be together forever, you clearly love me, right? I do love you. I looked up at him, my gaze serious and firm. But, Eric, I won't cross my bottom line just because I love you. As we spoke, the first snow began to fall. Soon it was all white. It was snowing. I stood up, walked to the French window, and suddenly said softly, I remember the last time it snowed. We snuggled on the couch, covered with a blanket, and watched TV shows together. I saw the leading actress in the show, wearing something different for her wedding, being considered to be climbing up the social ladder through her husband. I asked Eric with a smile if I would be considered climbing up by marrying him. You just laughed back then. Looking back now, were you secretly laughing at me, for daring to dream of marrying you? What am I, a minor celebrity, why should I marry you? Tears started to fall as I spoke. I wiped them away, trying to hide the traces of sadness. Too disheveled. I don't like seeing myself like this. However, the more I wiped, the more tears flowed. The pain in my chest was dense and throbbing. Eric spoke somewhat obscurely, I've never thought that way. I moved my lips, with a hint of self-mockery in my smile. But have you ever thought of marrying me? Eric froze. He opened his mouth, but said nothing at that moment. I had my answer in my heart, he hadn't. He never thought of marrying me. I was mentally prepared, but still felt sad after knowing the truth. I blinked, looked at him, and said with bitterness, many people say we argue and fight, they don't know the reasons, but you and I both know. I wanted to get married, you didn't. You said you were busy with work, had to settle things at home first. I understood you, that's why I forgave you repeatedly. If you had told me earlier that you wouldn't marry me, why did I bother pleasing your parents? Why did I waste so many years with you? I was really foolish. People always say love can blur one's mind and eyes. I used to not believe it. But now, I do. How else could I be foolish enough to be deceived for 7 years by repeated lies and excuses? Foolish enough to not see the true thoughts of the people around me day and night. Foolish to be cheated on, but still feel heartache for him. Eric, let's break up. I finally said that, seriously, and firmly. At that moment, I felt like I had unloaded the burden on my heart and body. Incredibly relaxed. But Eric just looked at me, withdrew the tenderness, his gaze deep and indifferent. He spoke clearly and heavily. Helen, you will regret this. I didn't understand the meaning of this sentence back then. But later on, I started to be dropped from continuous contracts. My resources, my endorsements, even with a high breach of contract fee, they all ended the cooperation with me. And then, they all signed with Mandy. At that moment, I understood. Eric was showing me off, telling me through actions, look, if you're not willing to be my lover, there are plenty of people who are willing. At the banquet. With the arrival of one person, it reached a climax. The internationally renowned director who had just returned to the country, James. Mary whispered to me, Jack is also here. His new movie is currently casting for the female lead. You've always liked him, right? I heard he has always admired you. You should compete for this opportunity. All right. I was about to approach Jack with a glass of champagne when I saw Eric holding Mandy's hand, coming to Jack's side. Jack, this is Miss Mandy I introduced to you. Mandy caught my eye, her eyes full of smugness. Eric played matchmaker, and soon Jack started talking to Mandy about the movie storyline. I hesitated for a moment, but still decided to approach him. Jack, hello. Who is she? Jack looked puzzled. Before I could introduce myself, Eric suddenly spoke. She's my former lover. Former lover. The ending was ambiguous. My heart skipped a beat. I turned to look at him, only to meet his challenging gaze. He did it deliberately. He knew I wouldn't accept those two words. Yet he insisted on labeling me with that title. Looking away, he smiled coldly, average acting. In one sentence, he effortlessly defined my 10 years of effort. At this, Jack didn't even look at me again. At that moment, I realized that the opportunity one had been waiting for years was gone. A sense of emptiness filled my heart, feeling something escaping rapidly. I turned and left. But at the backstage corner, I ran into Eric. He leaned against the wall, tilted his head to look at me, reflecting colorful lights in his eyes, yet devoid of any warmth. He asked me, Helen, do you regret it? After leaving me, losing so much. Do you regret it? Come back to me, all those things you wanted, they'll be yours again. I looked up at him, my gaze clear and gentle. But there was no hint of regret. I smiled gently, Eric, I never regret. No more. Just no more. Due to Eric's interference, all endorsement contracts were terminated, giving me a rare vacation. I had been in the industry for 10 years, always busy. Suddenly having some free time, I didn't know what to do. While cleaning the room, I found a shirt in the closet. There was a cufflink embedded on the cuff. Black Crystal S.I. tried to remember when he left this shirt, but couldn't. I thought about throwing it away. However, remembering Eric had mentioned the value of this cuff, I left it aside. I didn't want to owe him anymore. I informed his secretary to come and take it. Over the phone, his secretary whispered, Miss Helen, Eric has been talking about you a lot these days. He still loves you. It's just that his family is very strict about marriage, so Eric resorted to this strategy, making you a mistress, not his true intention. His words were cautious but couldn't hide the indifference in his tone. They never considered themselves as lovers, being a mistress was something unsightly. I agreed with a nod. Got it. The secretary asked cautiously, Miss Helen, when are you coming back? I can come pick you up. I interrupted him, saying firmly, I'm not going back. It's over between him and me. I don't like feeling embarrassed. And I have no regrets. As soon as I said that, I heard a loud thud on the phone. Eric's hoarse voice came through, then just leave, and go far away. It turns out he had been there the whole time, acting childish as always. Every time he messed up, he would make the secretary figure out my attitude. But this time, I wasn't going to be soft. After hanging up the phone looking at the shirt stuffed in a trash bag, I suddenly felt like returning home. I missed my mom and dad. I could visit them tonight. I called my mom on the train. Excitedly, my mom called out to my dad, and he smiled, giving me advice. Be careful on the way, watch your wallet. Mom and Dad are waiting for you at the train station gates. I chuckled helplessly. I was already 32, having been in the entertainment industry for 10 years. Yet Mom still reminded me to watch my wallet. It felt like I was still the young girl who had just left for college. When I got off the train, I saw my parents waiting eagerly at the gate. Approaching them, my mom held my hand, looking me up and down, while my dad took my suitcase. He looked around and asked, "Helen, why are you back? Where's Eric?" I hesitated for a moment. Mom playfully tapped Dad and pretended to be annoyed, saying, "Eric must be busy, your daughter is back, and you're worried about someone else. What kind of father are you?" It was Dad's fault. He quickly said, "I'll cook your favorite dish today to make up for it." There was a hint of worry in my parents' gaze. I smiled and nodded firmly. Back at home, Dad went to prepare dinner, while Mom helped me tidy up my room. Though my room was always neat and tidy. Parents often worry that they may impede the growth of their children once they leave home, so they express their concerns through details, like entering their child's room time and again. Sitting, observing. My mom seemed hesitant to speak but eventually asked, "Helen, did you have a fight with Eric? Did Eric upset you again?" Mary always said I was causing trouble in my relationship with Eric, but my mom believed it must be Eric's fault. I didn't want her to worry about my love life, so I just said, "We broke up." But this time, Mom walked over, glanced at my face, embraced me gently, and whispered, "Did Eric bully you?" I was stunned. When I found out that my lover of 7 years never intended to marry me, I didn't cry. Losing endorsements didn't make me cry. When asked if I regretted anything, I still didn't cry. Because I knew crying wouldn't help. It would only invite ridicule. But at that moment, leaning on my mom's tender and warm embrace, tears that I had held back for too long finally fell uncontrollably. I just felt like maybe I was wrong from the start. I shouldn't have accepted Eric's confession. I shouldn't have been with him. I shouldn't have been soft and continued the relationship after realizing he didn't want to get married. Maybe I was really wrong. But my mom just gently wiped away my tears and whispered, "Helen, just as a fairy has to face a tribulation when descending to the mortal world, perhaps Eric was your emotional trial. We spent 7 years overcoming it, and Helen's happiness is what Mom should be happy about. Because Mom believes that in the days to come, Helen will have smooth sailing." Really? I looked up at her. Mom's response was resolute, "Of course." At that moment, my long-held uneasiness finally dissipated. "We'll always be your support, boldly walk your path, and if you ever get tired, come back. Mom's embrace will always be open to you." Lying in bed, Mom tucked me in, the drowsiness setting in, the setting sun outside casting a gentle glow on her face. Suddenly, I said, "Mom, I want to see the sunrise tomorrow." Mom pushed my stray hair back, nodding gently. "Okay." Dad and Mom were both there. That was good. The next morning, Dad and Mom were ready to go. The sun had not yet risen, a light mist hung in the air. The mountain path was quiet, with just a few figures scattered along the way. Walking in the mountains, the fresh scent of the trees seemed to wash away the heaviness in my heart. As a surprising voice came from behind. "Mr. John." I turned around. A man in a black tracksuit strode towards us. His dark hair slightly damp, highlighting his handsome and fair face. He looked at my parents and smiled warmly. "Teachers, do you remember me?" My parents were puzzled at first but then smiled with delight. "Andy. Andy, didn't you go abroad? Why are you back in the country?" The man explained with a smile, "I finished my research project, so I decided to come back home for a while." My mom pushed me forward. "Andy, remember Helen? You used to play together a lot when you were kids." The man approached me, his voice soft and deep. "Helen, do you remember me?" I blinked, smiling slightly. Of course I remember Andy. My childhood companion who grew up with me. We were neighbors in the alley and deskmates at school. His parents were busy with work and often forgot to pick him up. But my parents, being elementary school teachers, felt that all kids in the world were lovable and soft, so they brought him home. We ate, played, went to school together. We were always together. Many kids teased me that I would be his future wife. Then Andy would give them a beating. One afternoon, I helped him apply medicine to his injured hand. I quietly said it wasn't worth fighting for them. Andy flicked my forehead lightly. I'm not doing it for them, but for you. I was stunned. He looked at me, sighed, patted the place he had flicked earlier. Although his touch was gentle, he said in a gentle yet tender voice, Helen, you're a girl, can't let people talk behind your back. But with me around, don't worry. But later, he went abroad with his parents, initially staying in touch and sharing funny stories from their lives over the phone, but somehow, it stopped. Until now. Meeting again. These years, I've been tired from working out and couldn't keep up with my parents' fast pace. By the end, there was no one around except Andy. I didn't say anything. He didn't disturb the silence. We just walked quietly, looking. Helen, this is for you, Andy said, handing me a lily flower. The petals were dewy, making them even more beautiful. I wondered when Andy picked it. I asked softly, why did you suddenly give me flowers? Andy smiled. Just thought to wish you a smooth life, he said casually. I was surprised, looking up at him. I suddenly realized that the boy in my memory had grown into a tall young man. The sunlight seemed to favor him, shining through the leaves onto him, like casting a halo. With a slight curve at the corner of his eye, a touch of humor and tenderness made him charming and irresistible. I accepted the flower with a gentle smile, thank you. And at that moment, the sun was rising. The golden sunlight shone down, radiant and grand. My mom waved at us and said, Andy, let's take a photo together here. We walked up with a smile. The shutter clicked. Time froze in that moment. In the photo, I was smiling, relaxed. Ahead of me was the road. Beside me, family and friends. And behind me, the dazzling sunlight. From now on, my life would start anew. After that meeting, I found out that the old house in Andy's alley was still not sold. We became neighbors again. With nothing to do, we often went hiking and drinking together. He never asked how I had been all these years. I never told him. Until one day, coming back from an art exhibition, I saw a familiar car at the alley entrance. As I walked closer, I saw Eric. He was leaning against the car, a frown on his face, surrounded by extinguished cigarette butts. When he saw me, he hurriedly put out the cigarette and walked towards me. But when he saw Andy beside me, he stopped in his tracks. He called out to me, Helen, come here. I looked at him expressionlessly, then turned around and walked past him towards Andy. Eric was taken aback. He never expected me to be so cold towards him. The words he wanted to say got stuck in his throat, unable to utter a single word. I had intended to walk away. But seeing the curious glances around us, I remained in front of Eric and said politely, do you need something? Eric's eyes lit up, but before he could speak, his car, blocking the alley, honked impatiently. I added, if there's nothing, please leave. Your car is blocking the way for others. My words were distant and courteous, like strangers. Eric's expression darkened, showing a hint of helplessness. Helen, after all this time, why can't you forgive me? What do I need to do for you to come back to me? I've missed you so much. Without you around, my home feels empty and scary, he said, stepping closer to me, wanting to hold my hand. I avoided him at this point. He still didn't understand. He thought I was just sulking. He tried to coax me, expecting me to give in as I had every time we broke up in the past. But not this time. I wouldn't go back. I was tired of Eric's persistence. I led him to a secluded place. Facing the man before me, I said softly, Eric, your family wants you to enter into an arranged marriage, and you want me to be your lover as well. If my family also wants me to get married, would you be my lover too? Eric was stunned. His face grew pale. You don't want to? He asked, crestfallen. Why? If you're getting married, I'm getting married. Isn't that fair? In the deserted alley, my questions echoed. Eric's face turned a shade whiter. He looked at me, then at Andy, who was waiting at the entrance of the alley. From his usually confident gaze emerged a crack, slowly but distinctly. He had misunderstood. But I didn't want to explain anymore. I didn't need to. With a tinge of self-deprecation in my voice, I continued, Eric, haven't you always felt that we were unequal from the beginning? You come from a wealthy family, you need to preserve your career through arranged marriage, while I'm just an ordinary person, incapable of assisting in your career but good enough to be your lover. You always said you loved me, yet deep down, you look down on me. You ask if I regret it now? I really don't. I sighed lightly, a hint of regret in my eyes. After all, we truly loved each other once. I don't want to condemn my former self who chose to be with you with an unsightly ending. We were both young then, thinking love was eternal, forgetting that hearts can change. I loved the Eric from college who sang love songs loudly on the campus to win my heart, the Eric who was willing to give up everything for my love, the Eric who strived for marriage freedom. Not the Eric standing before me now, willing to give up on me for ambition. Maybe his choice was not wrong, but it's not what I like anymore, so I don't regret it. Perhaps my mom was right, Eric was indeed my emotional obstacle. Sadly, I tangled with this emotional obstacle for the best 7 years. But fortunately, my life is more than just 7 years. I allow myself to be sad, upset, broken-hearted, but I can't stay put. I have ambition. My ambition won't allow me to stop. So, Eric, we are really over. As I finished, I smiled lightly, just like before. But no, not anymore. Yet Eric seemed half-shattered. He groaned, clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his eyes teary and ready to cry at any moment. Feeling nothing, even taking a step back to avoid any potential harm, although I knew he wouldn't. At that moment, I was certain that I no longer loved him. I found his every emotion bothersome. I stood my ground, cold and unaffected, and then I turned and walked away. Passing by him, Eric raised his hand as if to grab me, but ultimately did nothing. As I neared the corner, I looked back. Eric was still standing at the alley entrance, stubbornly watching me, his back slightly hunched, looking fragile and pitiful. He opened his mouth, hesitated, and asked me finally, Helen, did I really make a mistake? I didn't answer. Instead, I kept walking without looking back. This, now, was my answer. On the way home, the distance is quite short. But we both unconsciously slowed down our pace. Originally, I wanted Andy to go back first. I wanted to sit for a while and feel the breeze. But he sat silently beside me. He didn't ask, and I didn't want to talk. It wasn't until the stars lit up the night sky and the cool breeze dried my tears. Andy handed me a tissue and gently asked, Helen, was he bullying you? I was taken aback. These words sounded all too familiar. My mom had asked me the same question before. At this point, I had nothing to hide. So, I sighed lightly and with a bitter smile, said, I've been with him for 7 years. He is getting married next year and wants me to be his mistress. It sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. Sometimes I wonder if I am not cut out for marriage. Why didn't Eric, after 7 years of love, ever consider marrying me? Andy paused, stood up, squatted in front of me, and looked at my teary eyes. He wanted to say something but just muttered under his breath, what a jerk. Then he added, a clueless jerk. He was handsome and had a bright smile. When he's not talking, he's like a gentle scholar. But seeing him so indignant right now was a bit out of character yet quite endearing. I couldn't help but laugh and nod in agreement, yes, clueless. As I laughed, he also eased up and smiled gently. Are you going back? He asked. I nodded, of course. My ambition won't allow me to stay still. My love life was a mess. Eric wanted to ruin my career and force me back to him. But he underestimated me. I never move forward without looking back. Even if I'm covered in bruises from the thorns along the way, I won't give up. I won't stop moving forward. Andy looked at me for a long time, then stood up and extended his hand to me. He said, that's good. He said, The Helen I know is resilient like this. Finally, he said, then I wish you smooth sailing from now on. The wind made the bells on the window chime. Ding ding, ding. It was clear and pleasant. I looked up at him, smiled brightly, and said, I wish us both. A month later, during a beautiful sunset, Andy proposed to me. It was sudden. He got down on one knee, took out a ring, and with a trembling voice, he expressed his feelings. Helen, I know today is so sudden, but I have thought about it thousands of times and made this decision. I am not forcing you to be with me. I just want to tell you that you are not an unloved little girl, and you are not unsuitable for marriage. It's just that others don't have the vision to see how great Helen is. They don't deserve you. My heart skipped a beat. I suddenly remembered the words I said last month. Maybe I'm not a good candidate for marriage, but now, he was giving me his answer. He told me that I was better than anyone else. He said, Helen, don't worry. He told me he liked me. He said he never forgot about me. He even told me that the reason he returned home was not for vacation, but because he heard about my breakup with Eric, abandoned his research, and hurried back home. I just felt like you needed comfort at this moment. Now, I see that I underestimated Helen. Helen can handle things herself. He said this with some shyness and pride. I couldn't help but smile. I laughed and then cried. I had imagined countless times how a proposal would be, grand or magnificent, but in the end, it was simple. Yet so moving. My parents were there, looking at me with tearful smiles. They loved me and would never pressure me into any decision. So, I accepted Andy's ring. In that moment, it wasn't a shackle of marriage but a precious gift. A young man's earnest intentions. As the last tear fell, I whispered, I think I can consider it. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Mary, notifying me of my nomination for Best Actress at the film festival. I needed to be there. I arrived early, and a familiar makeup artist whispered gossip to me. The most eye-catching was about Eric and Mandy. It was said that Eric had officially announced his engagement to Amy, but surprisingly, he was reluctant. There was quite the commotion a few days ago. Was Eric really planning to marry Mandy? Mandy had skyrocketed in popularity recently, snatching many opportunities from others. Eric seemed to indulge her. Wasn't he afraid of repercussions one day? She paused and sighed, Helen, you have escaped from the sea of suffering. I always knew a person like Eric was not in our league. I heard his parents arranged his previous engagement. Lately, his father's illegitimate son came looking for him, almost the same age as Eric. Such a family background is not something we can accept. I opened my eyes. In the mirror, my reflection had exquisite makeup, rosy lips, a slight smile, looking radiant. Not far away, there stood a figure. Familiar and cold. There were bruises on his eyes, written all over with fatigue. Mandy was clinging to his arm, smiling sweetly and vivaciously. But he was just looking at me through the mirror. I averted my gaze first, sneered softly, and said, yes, I can't accept it. So, I don't want him. It was time to go in. I drew back the curtains, lifted my skirt, and entered the hall. Then I turned around, took out the ring from my bag. After a moment of contemplation, I wore it on my ring finger. In the end, the title of Best Actress slipped through my fingers, belonging to Mandy. Mandy stood on the stage, giving her acceptance speech. The spotlight shone on her, and at that moment, she seemed to be the winner of life. Having debuted just 2 years ago, she had secured the Best Actress position that I had pursued for 10 years, endorsed various luxury brands. With Eric by her side, how couldn't she be the winner of life? I sighed, exchanged a helpless look with director Chris, stood up, and left first. Walking backstage, I unexpectedly ran into Eric. He was on the phone, visibly upset. How could Mandy be the Best Actress? Didn't I tell you not to interfere with today's awards? The voice on the phone said something. Eric hung up the phone in silence, then rushed to the banquet, grabbed Mandy's wrist, and dragged her to the backstage. Mandy cried out in pain. Eric, however, just stared at her coldly and asked, was it you? Mandy froze, quickly defended herself, it wasn't me. The Best Actress award rightfully belonged to me. Helen's acting is average, how could she match up? But the next moment, Eric grabbed her neck firmly and said coldly, "Mandy, I don't want to hear a single bad word about Helen from you. You're not worthy. Helen has been in the industry for 10 years, won countless awards. I pressured sponsors to terminate contracts with her. Those sponsors were reluctant to sign with you but chased after her for endorsements. Without me, they would have all signed with her. Her popularity, her talent, you will never catch up in your lifetime. What are you worth? How dare you to judge her?" Hearing this, I was stunned. I had no idea that Eric held me in such high regard. But in the past, in front of everyone, he insulted me as a lover, and the one who criticized my acting was also him. He was always so hypocritical. I gave a scornful laugh, then quietly turned and left this farce. At the door, I was blocked by the reporters who had been waiting for me. Some were comforting, some were spectating, and of course, some were trying to sow discord. "Miss Helen, you lost the Best Actress award. Does it have anything to do with Eric? Do you regret breaking up with him now?" Facing the cameras, I chuckled lightly and flashed the engagement ring in my hand. "I'm getting married." As I spoke, a man not far away suddenly turned red-eyed, staring at me in shock, his face pale. He strode towards me, but Mandy grabbed his arm. I watched for a moment, then walked past the crowd and left the banquet. I got in the nanny car, with Mary looking at me hesitantly. I didn't want to explain. At that moment, the phone rang, and when I answered, a familiar voice came through. "Helen, I heard you're getting married." It seemed he was waiting in the live broadcast room. Otherwise, the news wouldn't have spread so quickly. I chuckled, "Yes." "With who?" He sounded a bit hopeful but cautious. There was a long silence, so long that all I could hear was their slow breathing. Finally, I said slowly, "It might be you." After that, Andy exclaimed, "I must go back to my country." I have to, but the next moment, an angry yell came through, "Come back. You've used up your 3-year leave this year." It was his supervisor. Listening to the noisy commotion on the phone, I unconsciously relaxed the tension I had been holding. It's fine like this. Just fine. The last time I saw Eric was on set. Mandy might have angered Eric, causing him to no longer favor her. And this signal was enough to amplify the anger of the person she had previously snatched resources from. In the end, it backfired. But I had no time to care about others' fates. I was busy comforting Andy, who couldn't return to his country, and focusing on studying projects, shooting new films, and commercials. Director Chris came looking for me again. Although Eric publicly denied my acting skills, which upset the director, I still went for the audition and smoothly passed it. Just as Eric had said, after mingling in the entertainment industry for 10 years, there was no doubt about my acting and abilities. The director apologized for underestimating me. Shook my head, indicating that I didn't mind. Before leaving, he mentioned, actually, even though Eric recommended Mandy, he didn't actually let her audition. Later, he told me that only with you in the lead role, would he invest in the production. But I believe even without him, knowing that the lead actress is you, other investors wouldn't refuse to fund the project. After all, your acting talent is commendable. My heart skipped a beat, unaware of such a story. But it was no longer relevant. In the end, I just smiled. Thank you. As I left the set, it was already dawn, with a hazy sky, and I realized it was snowing again. Another winter season. It seemed like I had a special connection with snow. I met Eric during the first snow, and we broke up 7 years later on the first snow. It was as if that moment foretold the ending between him and me. A cold, icy end covering all the past beauty. I stood quietly at the door waiting for a car. At that moment, a trembling voice came from behind me. Helen. I turned around to see Eric. He stood by my side, silent for a long time before finally speaking slowly. "I've been thinking a lot recently, and I realized I was truly wrong." I was surprised, turning to look at him. Only then did I notice how haggard he looked. His eyes were dark, bloodshot, with a stubble unshaven. He looked disheveled, and there was even a hint of alcohol on him. I discreetly distanced myself a bit from him. Eric noticed, paled, but forced a bitter smile, saying, "You never asked for anything from me in our relationship. I thought you couldn't live without me. That's why every time we broke up, I just needed to coax you, and you'd soften up. But I forgot that when you were willing to come back, it was because you loved me, and yet I mercilessly trampled on your sincerity." His voice choked with sobs. He said, "Helen, I'm sorry." He also added, "If I could do it over, I wouldn't let you down." At this, he looked at me with a glimmer of hope, but I had to shatter this fragile dream with my own hands. I told him, "If we could start over, Eric, pretend that you don't know me when you first met me." His expression turned blank for a moment, tears streaming down his face before hitting the ground, turning into ice instantly. I watched him, then smiled. "I don't want to entangle with you anymore." Just a few simple words that seemed to crush Eric, who stared at me with red eyes but nodded, "Okay." As I got into the car, Eric was still standing in place, looking at me. It resembled the scene of our breakup. But no matter the occasion, I never turned back. After getting out of the car and standing downstairs, I suddenly saw a familiar figure not far away. My heart skipped a beat, and I ran towards him. He caught me. And at that moment, the sun rose. The warm sunlight dispersed the icy cold of the first snow and cleared away the darkness of the night. He said, "Helen, I'm back." I gazed into the distance. The sun was shining bright the first snow fell. But I felt like I wouldn't be cold in the winters to come. Because I had caught the rising sun.